Great, thank you so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And I also appreciate your invitation to this series. And it's an honor to be sort of the closing act for what has been a really awesome and educational group of speakers that I'm honored to be a part of. I want to add to Jared's land acknowledgement. Right now, I'm sitting somewhat south of Sami traditional land, but Sami fire cultures are an important part of Norwegian history, which I'm learning more about. And I also want to acknowledge Late Dene, whose land I live on and work on when I'm not in Norway, and where a lot of the research that I'm going to present to you today was conducted. These are the people who have a stake in fire and smoke futures in BC, which is the subject I'm going to talk about, because they live proximately to forest fires and they're engaged actively in stewardship of the land. And I'm particularly grateful for all the time and energy of Indigenous governments and citizens in BC who negotiate every day with bureaucracies and industries as part of their efforts to steward and protect the land, which is something that, of course, gets more and more important as we reckon with modern fire regimes. So I just want to make sure that my screen can be seen and is okay. Can you give me a heads up on that? Okay, great, thanks. Okay. So in the fall of 1950, Europeans looked into the sky to witness a strange phenomenon. The sun and the moon had turned blue. A variety of possible reasons were posited. Here, Verdon's gang guessed that it was due to ice crystals floating at great height. Other outlets posited pollution from Germany or Indonesian volcanoes or dust from the Sahara Desert. The real source was even further afield than anyone imagined. The Boreal Forest of Western Canada, in an area near the Peace River district, near to where I grew up, had seen a fire that had been burning for almost 4 months. That June, local fire rangers alerted their bosses to this small lightning fire. The blaze was far from any structures and not burning any valuable timber, so they were ordered in June to let it be. All through June and July, the fire kept smoldering. It burned through some old logging waste, and still the Forest Service did nothing. In fact, by burning through the logging waste, the fire had done them a favor. But then in September, a windy day blew together this little fire with some other local fires and created a power event known afterwards as the Chinchaga Firestorm. And this fire was so powerful that it created its own weather. Its heat and wind punched up through the planetary boundary layer into the jet stream, where over the next few weeks, it would be carried tremendous distances. Winds carried it first to Edmonton, then Toronto, Ottawa, New York, Edinburgh, Berlin, and Bergen. By early October 1950, the smoke had circumnavigated the entire Northern Hemisphere and come back to Northern Canada. We can find traces of its smoke deposited in Alaskan ice. The Chinchaga Firestorm is a well-documented example of something that we are experiencing now more frequently in the present. But it was not isolated. In 1910, forest fires from North America created a smoke cloud that similarly traveled across to Europe. And in 1932, ships in the Atlantic were wrecked when they lost their way in smoke clouds. Scientific studies give us the tools we need to start piecing together a history of forest fire smoke over time. You can look at fire incidences, which of course, you can make inferences about smoke from, and I've done this myself a little bit later on in this talk to make some inferences about how much smoke people were breathing in. But while where there's smoke, there's fire, where there's fire, there's not necessarily smoke. Whether or not we get smoke in the atmosphere is determined by different factors: size of the fire, material burned, the intensity of the blaze, and most importantly, weather. Another method is to look at black carbon depositions in ice. So for example, Greenland ice core research suggests that local ice preserves a good record of fire in North America. North American plumes tend to deposit in Greenland. And in this example that I've put on the screen, we can see the medieval warm period marked, which resulted in an increase in fire due to warming and drying weather, and thus transient smoke, which left deposits in the ice. But it can be quite tricky to separate forest fire smoke from other kinds of burning, especially fossil fuel burning. Different methods have been tried to isolate the unique signatures of forest fire smoke from other kinds of black carbon, which deposits in ice, with varying levels of success. And this hints at a tricky categorization problem. Given the fact that forest fire smoke can contain any number of different markers, depending on what it burns through, what makes forest fire smoke from different kinds of other types of biomass smoke. And this is a question that we'll get into a little bit more later. Meanwhile, in the present, transient smoke events continue and are getting worse. Annually, Europe's Copernicus atmospheric monitoring system tracks wildfire smoke as it crosses the Atlantic in the summer and fall, the result of climate change and its impacts on both our forests and on our air currents. While Chinchaga and the ice core research that I just showed you can show us the smoke events we have today aren't unprecedented, we are now seeing more of them and at larger scales as wildfires get more intense. For environmental historians, I would argue, creating timelines of smoke events is interesting, but can only get us so far. The bigger and more important question is, why do we notice some wildfire smoke plumes and not others? What was happening in 1950 that made people in Norway and other parts of Europe turn their eyes toward the sky and begin to speculate about their possible connections to distant environments? And why is it then that when we look into the smoky sky today, we see it as a sign of apocalypse, the product of a world on fire, and the consequence of climate changing beyond our control? In Canada, where I come from, when we're talking to our neighbors, we have begun to call the late summer and early fall the smoke season. This is the time of year when pleasant summer activities are no longer possible because of the danger of wildfire smoke, when the sun turns into this eerie orange color and the sky is heavy. This change in the vocabularies of my neighbors is an artifact of climate change, which signals how in many communities we no longer have the classic 4 seasons. In an era of increasingly aggressive fire regimes, we have incorporated this 5th season, the smoke season, into our idea of an annual cycle. And since I've used this term in my talk, I do want to point out that me and my neighbors in British Columbia didn't invent this term. People have been referring to the smoke season probably for centuries. And I've traced the epistemology at least as far away as places like West Africa, where local people referred to smoke seasons when talking to colonizers. And as the second quote on the right shows, they actually included these smoke seasons in their seasonal rounds and seasonal activities. So this is not a new term. But as the climate changes, we are in for longer and more of these smoke seasons. As the weather gets hotter and drier, it's more likely to produce the kinds of highly intense fires that can push smoke high into the atmosphere and travel long distances. And we might even start getting them at different times of year. So this is the wildfire emissions update for the end of March this year, where we can see that in the Southern Hemisphere or in the mid-latitudes, the smoke season is well underway. And the smoke season will roll through the latitudes as the summer progresses. Smoke seasons are important to understand because they come with real and significant harms. Recent studies have shown that wildfire smoke is more dangerous than other types of air pollution. It kills more than 300,000 people each year globally, 2/3 of whom live in Southeast Asia and Southern Africa. And as the statistic suggests, smoke has uneven impacts in that it hurts young people, elderly people, those with lung conditions, and people who work outside or don't have access to purified air. And smoke is also driving climate change with its myriad unequal impacts. Smoke can accelerate glacial melt rates when black carbon settles in glacial ice, traps the sun, and makes them heat up faster. And it is, of course, the physical manifestation of carbon release from fire. So, for example, we know that in California, the worst days of wildfires generated emissions that were roughly 4 to 8 times higher than the average daily emissions from all other economic activity across that state. And as an environmental historian, wildfire smoke fascinates me because of its transience and mobility, which make it both tricky and useful as a historical subject. Smoke is a useful tool to think with on the planetary scale. Like other subjects of environmental history, it has little respect for our administrative boundaries, and so it forces us to think across borders. A wildfire or a river can, of course, cross an international border and therefore be an interesting subject for historical or comparative analysis, but smoke can cross continents. It takes us from the very microscopic. Smoke is particulate resulting from incomplete combustion of oils and wood and other materials that a fire burns through, to the macroscopic, the systems of wind and climate that circulate the earth. As we rise up from burning forests to follow smoke, we must consider how the profoundly local, the burning of trees, which are rooted in a particular time and place, is also inherently planetary. So in this image, as people in Chile take on bits of burned Australian bush into their lungs, they are incorporating that place very literally into their bodies. This is a kind of relationality which is at once both intimately personal and at the same time a widely shared experience. Wildfire smoke is, after all, the medium through which most of us will experience wildfire in our lifetimes. Some of us might be evacuated, or we might be involved in firefighting, but it's likely that all of us listening today will at one point in our lives breathe wildfire smoke, and likely have already. And so it's worth asking, what is our relationship with wildfire smoke? How has it changed over time? And how can it inform our future relationship with fire on an increasingly smoky planet? As we grapple with a smoky present and come to terms with the certainty of a smoky future, what can the past offer us, both in terms of potential lessons and potential for integrating smoke into our lives? Can we have a relationship with smoke that is healthy and just? As Professor Kavita Phillip and Dr. Paroma Waggle argued in the previous talk for this series, universalism must share the stage with unique and specific stories from below. And further translating between the local and global scales is one way in which historians can speak most effectively about the climate crisis. So that's what I'm going to do today, using one of the smokiest places in the world, the Pacific Northwest of Canada. I'm going to introduce you to one explanation for our modern relationship with smoke. I will trace the changes in our relationship with smoke over the past century, as we went from a relatively smoky society to a much more smoke-phobic one. And in doing so, I want to emphasize the relationship between smoke and power and think about who benefits from wildfire and its smoke versus who bears its burdens. And lastly, today, of course, I will engage in some future gazing, where I will reflect on the possible futures of fire and smoke in the world, some of which I think environmental historians are particularly well positioned to inform. So my current research is focused on British Columbia, where I'm from, on the Pacific Northwest coast of Canada, and also Norway, where I'm living and working now. Both are right on the edge of the boreal halo at the top of the Northern Hemisphere. The boreal forest is defined not by fire, but by snow. It's a forest that has an annual snowpack and freezing temperatures from 6 to 8 months of the year. The boreal forest is also a fire ecology. Major species include a collection of fire-philic trees and shrubs, including pines, spruce, and heathers. These species are fire adapted, meaning that they benefit from regular low-intensity burns. In the 21st century, we get most of our megafires in the boreal forest, and so most of our long-range smoke events of the kind that I talked about earlier, Chinchaga and others, originate in this landscape. There are biological reasons, of course, having to do with the fire-adapted species that call these spaces home, but there's also some important historical factors at work. The first of these historical factors is that the boreal forest tends to be more sparsely populated than areas to the south. So there's few values that would result in the early suppression of fires. So in the boreal forest, fires are allowed to grow big enough to create events like the Chinchaga Firestorm, and big enough to create smoke plumes that can punch up through the planetary boundary layer. The second historical reason is colonization. Since ice has retreated from the boreal forest, it's been burning. Before colonization, those burns were often set and managed by Indigenous people. After colonization, fire practices didn't end, but they were often suppressed in favor of regimes oriented towards the capitalist industrial economy. In the boreal zone, forests that were already prone to fire were made more so through a combination of suppression policies, monocropping, herbicidal spraying, planting, and waste disposal practices, which looked different in different places, but which generally have had the same effect, namely to allow for big violent fires that create big mobile smoke plumes. So this image is from a plantation in Norway where we have Sitka spruce on the right and Norway spruce on the left. Sitka spruce was planted here in Norway because it's a much nicer tree for foresters. And pretty much all the spruce trees that I have here around me in Rogaland, all the evergreens, in fact, are Sitka spruce that have been planted in the last century. Sitka grows bigger, it has less underbrush, there's more timber to be had. But there's some studies that suggest that it's also more prone to fire than Norway spruce. So this is just one of the many ways that we have changed the boreal forest in a way that's made them even more fire prone and even more explosive. British Columbia on the edge of the boreal zone is a good case study for understanding our relationship with smoke because it's historically been a very smoky place. Most of its population of 5 million is concentrated in the southwest in Vancouver and Victoria, with some smaller population centers in the central and southern interior. So Kelowna, which I've indicated on the map, is very close to the town of Lytton, which was famously completely destroyed by wildfire this past summer after reaching record-breaking temperatures of around 50 degrees Celsius. And Prince George, which is where I'm from, is a natural resource community largely dependent on forestry, and it's kind of the largest population center in the north, and you can see it's right there on the edge of the boreal zone. North of Prince George then is more sparsely populated and tends to burn quite often with these large fires that are unchecked. And the coast, Vancouver and Victoria, is often subject to smoke from California, Oregon, Washington, and Alaska, since air currents tend to shunt smoke up and down this coast. But most importantly, from a historian's perspective, about 94% of the land in British Columbia is designated Crown land, meaning that only 5% is privately owned, and the story of forest management is a very consistent one across the province. So whereas here in Norway, for example, land is managed quite differently depending on whose land you're on, in British Columbia, we have a single land manager, pretty much, executing a uniform vision for forestry over the entire province, this large landmass, since the turn of the century. BC has also been lauded as a leader in forestry, especially in wildfire management, partially because of this large percentage of land that's owned by the government. And as a result, we have some of the most expensive fire crews in the world, which sort of speaks to our expertise in wildfire management. Of course, the Forest Service didn't record smoke production, but we do know what happened on the land over the last century in terms of burning. And from that information, we can make some inferences about wildfire smoke. In the early 20th century, we had a pretty close relationship with smoke, both wild and domesticated. And I think this holds more broadly. In industrial and resource communities of the type that typifies much of the boreal and boreal proximal zone, people would have been quite used to breathing smoke, both of their own creation and from natural ignitions. We can see here the use of smoke to protect livestock from bugs, but smoking fish was also an important way of preserving protein in the fall. And in urban and industrial spaces, of course, people would have been used to breathing emissions from factory smoke. The ubiquity of smoke in people's lives can be seen in Forest Service records as well. In the early 20th century, the Forest Service built a collection of watchtowers across the province to look for smoke. This is something that most fire-inclined jurisdictions did, of course, the United States, and did this quite famously, and Norway and Sweden have done this as well. Russia has done this. During the dangerous season, the sky was clear so that watchers could see forest fire smoke. But at other times of year, smoke from logging operations, agricultural burning, and campfires made the landscape too confusing. Sitting in a watchtower was about deciphering good from bad smoke. And actually, you need a human being to do this right up until the present, because from a chemical or biological perspective, smoke exists on a pretty wide spectrum. So smoke might be caused from a lightning fire, but burning through logging waste. So is that good or bad smoke? Or it might be unintentional agricultural burn that escaped into nearby bush. So looking at smoke has always been a subjective and cultural practice based on what we as human beings, or in this case, government employers, decide is okay based on our particular set of values. When the Forest Service talked about who they wanted to hire to man watchtowers, they talked about local people, often hunters or trappers, who knew the land intimately. And so it's actually no coincidence that many of the people who manned these watchtowers were Indigenous people. They needed to know what was going on the land, and that so they could make decisions about which smoke columns were the result of legitimate human activity, desirable human activity, and which ones potentially threatened the valuable timber supply. Over the years, the Forest Service developed a collection of technologies aimed specifically at honing the human ability to detect smoke and make judgments about its desirability or undesirability. So from the far left, which shows a pretty rudimentary fire tower, through to the radio technologies on the right, which are about sort of communicating quickly when somebody spots smoke, to the bottom right, which is a technical firefinder, it's called, and this allows people in a watchtower to convey exact coordinates of a smoke column so that the Forest Service can respond. But ultimately, all of this technology is about amplifying the sensory and judgment abilities of human beings. So the story of smoke and fire in British Columbia lines up pretty well with what we know about other places, which is why it's a great case study, both in the Boreal Zone and elsewhere in the world, including Australia, the United States, and here in Norway. Between the beginning of the record in 1960, so from about the turn of the century till 1960, we have relatively regular fire years. They occur on roughly a 5-year cycle, and a good fire year, or one with low fire, sees about 100,000 acres burned. That's a good fire year in BC. Starting in the 1960s, we see a general reduction of fire on the land. Following the record-breaking year of 1958, which is represented by the large spike there just before 1960, we really start to see the impact of a suppression regime on the land. By the 1970s, a good fire year, or one with low fire, might see as little as 3,700 acres burned. So from 100,000 on a good year to 3,700, quite a reduction in the amount of fire. And this is a story of success of suppression in British Columbia. The watchtower system, in combination with improving technologies and British Columbia's initial attack program, was really successful at knocking down fires early, from the smallest little whiff of smoke that would be curling above the horizon to immediate response by local firefighting crews. And we now know that this strategy has contributed to the buildups of explosive fuels on the land in BC and elsewhere. But at the time, it was celebrated as moving closer towards the goal of the Forest Service. And if this graph continued, you would see, of course, the return of fires as big or bigger than the 1958 fire starting in the early 2000s. And those big fires would be coming at shorter and shorter intervals, which is the reality we exist in the present. Given the reduction in the number of fires overall, not just in British Columbia, but also in the United States, which was a big contributor to smoke loads in British Columbia, we might expect to see a similar reduction in human smoke observations. But in fact, the opposite is true. In the 1960s and 1970s, we see a dramatic rise in complaints about smoke coming from BC's most populated places. And what is happening, of course, is the rise of the environmental movement. Urban historians have chronicled the rise of urban environmental movements from the United Kingdom and mainland Europe, and eventually to the United States and Canada. As part of these initiatives, urban spaces adopted different ways of measuring and regulating urban smoke pollution from industrial sources. So for example, in British Columbia, we adopted the Ringelmann chart in the 1920s. But in articulating the problems of urban air pollution, activists sometimes cited forest fire smoke as exacerbating existing conditions. But there's little at the time that regulators can do about it. So while it's easy enough to fine a factory owner for his smoke production, who's a municipality going to go after when it comes to a forest fire? In British Columbia and in many places along the edge of the Boreal Forest, it took until the 1960s and the 1970s for urban air pollution regulations to really grow teeth. And there's a number of reasons for this, which have been explored at length by urban historians. And to summarize a pretty complex body of literature in about 2 sentences, industries were smaller and more spread out in some of these communities. And so smoke pollution was less bad. And communities were also dependent on those industries for their economic livelihood. So they accepted smoke pollution as the price one paid for wealth until the 1960s. So the environmental movement of the 1960s, most often characterized by the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, changed the nature of the conversation, and in British Columbia led to a sudden rise in interest in regulating urban air pollution, a cultural connection between clean air and health, and a new sense that smoke was both unnatural and undesirable within city limits. When urban people left the city to recreate, they were met with a rhetoric of suppression. And this rhetoric was led by, of course, a Forest Service that employed a cadre of young men to sit in watchtowers all summer looking for columns of smoke, and entreated its recreating constituents to report all suspicious smoke. As you can see in the photo on the left, this is sort of a famous artifact of BC history. The Forest Service didn't think twice about threatening death on people who didn't comply. And the result was a public that imagined healthy landscapes as clear and smoke-free, whether they were at home in the city or recreating in the woods. In general, people experienced less smoke in the late 20th century. And I'll refer back to this chart showing incidences of fire that I showed earlier. And yet the complaints about smoke get more frequent during these years. So what's going on? Certainly, urban air pollution is reducing people's tolerance for smoke, but also at the same time as wildfires are decreasing in BC, intentionally set fires are on the rise and people are not necessarily equipped to tell the difference. So for many years, logging waste, which is known as slash, was simply left on the land. Forestry law required companies to clean up waste through burning on the south coast near to populated areas, but they didn't have the same rules for the interior. And additionally, there were some years when the war or the depression had created huge backlogs in the amount of waste that was sitting on the land waiting to be burned. In the late 20th century, the Forest Service begins to burn that backlog. And not only that, but it brings in new legislation that requires logging companies to burn slash in the interior of the province. So prescribed burning triples on the land during this time period. What makes matters worse is that intentional burning of logging waste was being done in concentrated periods of good weather in the spring and fall. And we know from studies of urban air pollution that these are the times of year when industrial smoke is bad too because of temperature inversions. And also the Forest Service was not particularly sensitive to public concern. So for example, there are burns that are conducted right next to major highways in British Columbia or next to communities that are recently traumatized by wildfire. And when the Forest Service is questioned about the wisdom of lighting these fires and their smoke pollution, they emphasize the fact that these fires are safe and controlled, and moreover, that the smoke they produce is clean wood smoke, which it frames in opposition to dirty industrial smoke pollution. On the ground, however, people don't really buy it. And so to illustrate this tension between the Forest Service narrative and people's increasing complaints about air pollution from both wild and domesticated smoke, I'm going to tell you the story of the Glen Eden fire, an event which threatened to sort of end the ability of the Forest Service to burn in BC, and where we can clearly see how the matter of smoke and its relative wildness are culturally constructed and therefore were up for debate during this time. So in 1973, the BC Forest Service was supervising a controlled burn on the Fly Hills above the Glen Eden Valley. You can see that burn here. Glen Eden was a community of mostly retirees who had come to the Okanagan region of British Columbia from the busy urban landscapes of Vancouver in search of a quieter life, more connected to lakes and forests and all the associated recreational activities. The community was already pretty enthusiastic about the burn when it started. The weather was hot and dry. and the community had already been suffering from periodic smoke palls from local wildfires as well as local Forest Service burning. One afternoon, the wind picked up and the fire escaped. The Forest Service responded, but without enthusiasm. The escape was not thought to be threatening to the community since fires normally travel up ridges and not down, and the fire was already quite high at that time. However, strong winds proved them overly confident, blowing the fire down the mountain and into the valley, where it destroyed 16 homes and a few thousand acres of valuable timber. In the aftermath, the Forest Service was quick to emphasize the fire's escape and the unpredictable nature of the wind, which they claimed could not have been foreseen even by the best fire experts. The Eden Fire, as it was later dubbed, was, the Forest Service said, an act of God within the purview of non-human nature and totally beyond the ability of the Forest Service to control. Victims of the fire, as well as external observers, disagreed. In the words of one anger critic writing to the minister in the aftermath, nature did not instigate this fire, man did. British Columbians were quick to link Glen Eden with ongoing smoke pollution, which it argued the public argued discouraged tourism and ruined the recreational activities and quality of life that was available in southern BC. Smoke pollution and the destructive Glen Eden fire, they argued, was the fault of a flawed Forest Service, one that had been promising an end to wildfires and their smoke for 100 years and had failed in the end to deliver. The Forest Service, Glen Eden residents argued, should be held accountable. As citizens on a planet shaped by wildfire, I think we could all maybe stand to channel the energy of the white middle-class folks at Glen Eden. In British Columbia, the Forest Service differentiated between wild and not wildfire. It framed itself as a hero who, through increasingly sophisticated technologies, would end wildfire, the undesirable kind. British Columbians, as a result, understandably imagined a wildfire and smoke-free future, and they saw this as desirable. But in fact, a smoke-free landscape is not a healthy one from either an ecological or an economic perspective. And the Forest Service always understood this, they just didn't communicate it that well. When the Forest Service embarked on a suppression campaign, it failed to make room for what we call in the present context, good fire, or the fire that forest ecologists know is necessary on the land, especially as we were in the 20th century when you have massive buildups of explosive logging waste that you need to get rid of. But the Forest Service would continue to benefit from fire, the kinds lit by their own hands, as well as those lit by lightning or from sparks from trains or by smokers throwing their cigarette butts into the woods, so long as those fires didn't threaten values, a category of structures and environments, by the way, that the Forest Service defined, but which everyday people, particularly First Nations, don't always agree on. Without using so many words, British Columbia's Forest Service was asking its constituents to live with a little smoke pollution now to avoid greater smoke pollution later. In other words, if we didn't get rid of this logging waste now, it's going to become a wildfire later, which is going to create a smoke plume that goes on to pollute cities, and you don't want that. But the benefits of this bargain was not and is not clear to people. So to illustrate the contradiction that we're talking about here, consider that the Forest Service in BC until 1950 actually included natural ignitions when it tallied up its fuel management work at the end of the year. So wildfires were directly helping the Forest Service to obtain its land management objectives, and it took credit for the work of those fires on the land. And by the way, this is something that continues to happen in the present, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be really difficult to get permission to light a prescribed fire, even if it's really necessary, if wind conditions or pollution conditions aren't favorable. But if lightning happens to strike, the Wildfire Service in BC or in the United States in some places can choose to let a fire burn if it's not threatening any values, therefore accomplishing the same goals as a human lit fire would have, but without the same onerous permitting system. Yet when those same fires burned communities or polluted cities with their smoke, the Forest Service distanced themselves. So they would take credit only for this kind of smoke, the clean ones that and then that were above the limits of urban pollution that didn't contribute to it, and absolved themselves of responsibility for wildfire smoke, crying disaster, and the vagrancies of nature. What British Columbians objected to in 1973 in the aftermath of the Glen Eden fire, and what we should all object to now, is that smoke production occurs in the service of specific interests. Slash burning is about enabling the continuation of industrial forestry more than it's about controlling wildfire and wildfire smoke. So at Glen Eden, British Columbians didn't trust the Forest Service to make decisions about the timing of their burns or about their supposed necessity. And as a result, in 1973, the public, the media, called the whole practice of prescribed fire into question and suggested a collection of alternatives, from chipping to using logging waste for wood heat, which would function to eliminate both wildfire smoke and slash smoke while allowing the continuation of the industry. But ultimately, the Forest Service rejected all of these possible alternatives as impractical and too expensive for BC's forest industry, an argument that echoes the objections of factory owners to urban air pollution measures, as you can see in the urban air pollution historiography. And of course, this issue is incredibly complicated because the public also benefits from the continuation of industry, particularly in a place like British Columbia, which is tied pretty directly in an economic sense to the price of lumber. It's important to note here, I think, that communities are impacted by forest fire smoke unevenly. So we know that because of scientific studies in the present, but we can see that in the historical record as well. In British Columbia, rural and Indigenous communities living on the edge of forest fire regimes were more likely to live with all kinds of smoke, not just wildfire smoke, but also industrial smoke. Historians of resource communities have pointed out that living with pollution has historically been seen as the price one has to pay for wealth. So in British Columbia, wildfire smoke is part of that price. Living close to a forest comes with a collection of economic and recreational activities that one pays for by enduring smoke seasons. And the result is that in general, we see much fewer complaints from people in rural and resource communities when it comes to forest fire smoke, whether ignited by the Forest Service or through natural causes, even though they end up breathing a lot more of it, and even though smoke and fire represent a greater existential threat to those communities than to their urban counterparts. So in resource communities that are on the edge of the forest, smoke could actually signal a destructive forest fire in a way that it doesn't in urban spaces, where it's more of an annoyance or a sort of more abstract health concern. And by the way, yes, there's good research to show a positive association between Indigenous status, for example, and hospitalization during smoke events in Australia. And so to borrow the words of Max Lieberman, pollution is colonialism, and that includes wildfire smoke pollution. If we accept that colonial governments and the industrial forestry practices that they oversee are responsible for the current state of our forests, then we must also accept that they're responsible for smoke. So looking at British Columbia, I think that there are some wider lessons that we can draw for the present. First, our relationship with smoke has changed over time. Major smoke events were a regular part of our history until quite recently. Since the middle of the century, the combination of an environmental movement, which has rightly eschewed air pollution, with a widely adopted policy of suppression among most of the world's most explosive fire regimes, has created a culture of smoke intolerance. In the 21st century, smoke has returned with a vengeance. Classic fire regimes in North America, Australia, Northern Russia, and Southern Europe no longer have a fire season. We're dealing with year-round fires. And where we used to have good fire years and bad fire years, now every year is a bad fire year. We're also starting to see fires in places where we have not historically seen them before. So for example, we're seeing a rise of wildfire incidents here in Norway due to hotter and drier weather. And although normally the wildfire season here in Norway starts on April 15th, it actually had a very early start in late March this year, sign of a changing climate. And last year in 2021, Norway had some very violent fires, including one that jumped a 300-meter fjord to light the other side of the fjord on fire. So the size of our fires is growing, and the burns are becoming more aggressive and more destructive, far from the kinds of good fires that we need to maintain healthy ecologies. Our history, in combination with current events, has created a deep sense of disorientation and apocalypse for which wildfire smoke and its eerie colors and its insidious dangers has become a very powerful symbol. We have, on the one hand, explosive forests generating mass amounts of smoke, and on the other, large urban centers full of people for whom smoke has become a sign of wrongness in the environment, and for whom smoke represents a real threat, as we have seen. And in between those two sides of the equation, we have forests that depend on some level on smoke production for both economic and ecological health. So what happens next? Well, this prediction is actually quite an easy one. The future is smoky. There's many potential paths forward, but they all end in smoke. The only question, as far as I'm concerned, is how much smoke and when. Ideally, we choose to take responsibility for smoke. There's some indication that this is the direction that wildfire management is headed. There seems to be a widening understanding that prescribed fire, or the intentional burning of fuels in our forests to prevent wildfire, is the way forward. And prescribed fire has a number of known benefits, which people in Australia will be familiar with. They take place in the spring or fall when it's a lot safer to burn. They tend to be low intensity, so they don't kill trees. They get rid of invasive species. Like in Norway, we have a lot of juniper that can be cleared up through prescribed fire. In BC, we love prescribed fire because it gets rid of our Himalayan blackberry. And it can help pines and heathers that are dependent on fire in their cycles to reproduce. And it also frees up nutrients on the land. But prescribed fire also, importantly, reduces smoke. So prescribed burns don't create the kind of massive smoke plumes that we get from our modern megafires. And those kinds of fires can be conducted during good venting days that minimize human exposure to smoke. So it doesn't eliminate the hazards of smoke, but it creates opportunities for a more equitable distribution of smoke's impacts. I think prescribed fire is also very promising because it offers opportunities to heal our cultural relationships with the land. So in British Columbia, for example, the provincial government has recently announced $145 million towards developing a more proactive approach to fire. And prescribed fire is sort of underwritten here. It's a huge part of this. And the government is mandated to co-create this new prescribed fire work with First Nations. In the United States, the Biden-Harris administration recently announced $8.25 billion for hazard reduction and wildfire response. And again, prescribed fire is a big part of this. Wildfire scientists are saying that California needs to burn 1 million acres a year to stave off wildfire. And proponents of prescribed fire say, well, why not then teach 1 million people to burn 1 acre each? And Australia, of course, has led the world on prescribed fire, especially Indigenous-led fire. There's a real sense, as perhaps that quote about teaching 1 million people to burn 1 acre each might have told you, there's a real sense that people need to become comfortable with fire, to repair their relationship with it, and to incorporate it into their view of what a healthy landscape looks like. But where does smoke fit into all this? Everybody likes setting things on fire, but few people like breathing in smoke. And indeed, air pollution is one of the biggest barriers to prescribed fire. In most jurisdictions, ambient air pollution is reason enough not to burn. Environmental historians and environmental humanities people generally, I think, have a real role to play in helping us come to terms with smoke. After all, this is a cultural issue rooted in the binary nature of the nature-culture divide, and built on our belief that burning brush and its byproducts are somehow separate from us, despite our continuous interventions in these ecologies since the beginning of time. But there's also some barriers that we will need to work with. At the moment, the amount of land that we know would benefit from burning is astronomical compared to the amount being actually burned. And while some places, including Australia and places like Florida and the southeastern United States, they already do a lot of prescribed burning. Other places have been really slow to pick it up. And alarmingly to me, since they're the location of some of the worst megafires and their smoke plumes, most of the boreal states are actually quite behind on prescribed fire. So for example, in Norway, we have a few isolated studies of fire as a method for fuel treatment, but it's very limited. And this image is showing one of those studies conducted by the University of Bergen, just north of me, on heather landscapes. In my home community in British Columbia, unless you're a member of a First Nation who wants to do a very limited burn on a reserve, or unless you're a government agency who essentially is able to burn whenever they like, you face a lengthy and exclusionary permitting process. So cultural burning often doesn't fit into the kind of rigid requirements of these permitting processes, whereby you have to know exactly when and where your burning will take place. And burn plans are good, of course, but they do represent a significant barrier to the kind of citizen level engagement with fire that proponents of prescribed fire hope to see, particularly among Indigenous communities. This slowness of bureaucracy to adopt prescribed fire gets at the fact that in most jurisdictions, there's very little incentive for change in the status quo. Unless we acknowledge that we have been using wildfires to meet our land management goals in some cases, we can't integrate them into our forestry practices. Yet acknowledging that we have benefited from wildfire, no matter in how small a way, means that we also have to take responsibility for it and for its smoke, which is an increasingly terrifying prospect in 2022, these massive plumes. And so I understand the reluctance of wildfire agencies to turn over the keys to citizens when it comes to fire. Another barrier I see is the framing of prescribed fire as a panacea for catastrophic wildfire. There's a lot of optimism, I think, in the prescribed fire community, and it's deserved because it's got good science behind it and it's very promising in a number of different ways. But prescribed fire is not a silver bullet. We're not going to burn our way out of the climate crisis. The wildfire problem has been represented in, I think, a bit of an oversimplified way, which states that in the past, we didn't have enough fire because of suppression. And so to fix it, we simply have to add fire back. Problem solved. But our modern megafires are, of course, about more than suppression. They're also about industrial logging techniques, clear cutting, monocropping, imported species that I talked about earlier. So in Norway, for example, we can also trace rising incidents of wildfire to the industrialization of agriculture and the removal of animals from the mountains into centralized farms. They were no longer eating the fuels in the mountains, and so those fuels became more fire prone. So fires have complicated and pluralistic causes. And although it mitigates the issue, prescribed fire, of course, doesn't solve the problem of risk and its uneven distribution, particularly if we are asking Indigenous people, which we often are, to lead prescribed fire efforts. This means that Indigenous people are going to be exposed to wildfire smoke at higher levels than other parts of the population. This unequal distribution of the risks and benefits means that, for example, while forestry companies have profited from changes to the landscape for the past century or more, the planting of Sitka spruce, the monocropping of trees, the forestry industry, which has been tremendously profitable in British Columbia, Indigenous people are now being asked to clean up the mess, a mess that was not of their making and was in fact enabled in the first place by their alienation from fire cultures. Even more so than fire, smoke is a planetary problem with little regard for political or geographic boundaries. While a fire must be responded to at the jurisdictional level, the province in British Columbia, the municipal fire department here in Rogaland, smoke forces us to think collectively, from our urban environments to our forested or our bush-covered ones. In addition to connecting us across vast amounts of space, smoke connects us across time. When we breathe in wildfire smoke, we are ingesting physically into our bodies the history of industrialization, capitalism, and colonialism. Smoke blurs the nature-cultural boundary by defying easy categorization. So while systems like the Copernicus atmospheric monitoring system, for example, has a set criteria for defining whether or not a fire is wild based on its proximity to structures and surrounding landscape type, it doesn't make the same attempt for smoke, which must be collected more generally under the heading biomass burning aerosols. And so I hope this is perhaps a hint for us about our involvement in smoke's creation. I hope that in the future, we can think relationally about smoke. There are culturally connections between smoke and cleansing. After all, smoke signifies a clearing of brush, and it can bring grazing land for animals and wild berries in its wake. Without forgetting the real harms that smoke inflicts on our bodies, perhaps this way of thinking about smoke is the most productive way forward. It's possible that our hands are going to be forced, I think, on the matter of smoke. As wildfire smoke increasingly crosses huge distances, traveling from North America to Europe in the way that it does almost annually now, will Europeans breathing in the remnants of burned trees start asking whether or not there was more the Forest Service in the west of North America could have done to prevent these kinds of pollution? As the burdens of this new kind of pollution become increasingly severe, will urban populations breathing wildfire smoke continue to accept smoke into their bodies? Or will they begin to ask some of the same questions that they asked a century earlier about urban air pollution? Who is benefiting from wildfire smoke and who is carrying the costs? I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Micah. Can everyone hear me? I just want to make sure I'm unmuted.
I got you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to jump in for the Q&A. I just wanted to say again, thank you so much for this really wonderful talk and really provocative and timely, and definitely for all of us on the Australian East Coast, very relatable, I think. I'm going to open the floor. So if anybody has a question, please put your hand up. And if possible, also, it'd be great to see some faces if you could unmute your videos. Okay, we've got a hand up over here. Okay, please just jump in. I can't see whose hand is up.
Looks like it's Stephen.
Oh yeah, it is. Great, Steve. Steve, are you with us? Okay. I'm not sure what's going on there. So I just ask a very unformulated question that is not really a question, but what I was thinking with your talking about Sami cultures in where you are currently, and the labours that tend to be outsourced to Indigenous communities in BC, also here, with regards to fire management and prescribed burns in particular. I'm wondering if you could actually just speak a little more about the ways in which Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous labours are mobilised in your current part of the world.
In Norway.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is something I don't know a lot about.
Okay.
But I'll try and speak to it. So this is something that I would like to know a lot more about, but which I haven't sort of been able to get into yet. I don't have, like, I came to Norway a year ago. I don't have those kinds of relationships with communities here that I might have back home. But from the limited amount of secondary research that I've done, it seems that there are some traditional Sami fire practices that exist, especially sort of in the forested areas of Norway in the northeast of the country, crossing over into Sweden, where we have quite a lot of fire in the Boreal Forest. But I haven't seen, like, I think that the research that has been done so far, at least the research that I have seen, hasn't necessarily integrated those fire cultures into some of the burning that's going on. So I think in Norway, the academic interest in prescribed fire has sort of been separate a little bit from the study of and recruitment of Indigenous knowledge in land management. And that could be wrong, because it could be that it's a limit of my knowledge and not a reality, but it seems to me that that's the case. So I think that state of affairs probably can't continue for much longer in Norway. And I think that, Norway often looks to, and most places in the world often look to places like British Columbia and the United States for some of these fire practices, especially around prescribed fire, and especially around Indigenous relations, where Canada is often seen as a leader, however problematically. And so I suspect that if it hasn't already, that the integration of Indigenous knowledge and prescribed fire will become stronger and more apparent in Norway. At least I hope that's the case. But I think also a part of the problem is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of enthusiasm for prescribed fire as a method for fire management here. So I don't think that bureaucracies and wildfire managers are necessarily taking prescribed fire seriously at this point as a method for wildfire management in Norway. And there are some good reasons for that. Norway has other disasters that are sort of a lot more pressing. Landslides tend to be what one of the things that climate change has created here in Norway that have impacted a lot of people. And so in that sense, wildfire and prescribed burning have taken a little bit of a backseat. And that could explain sort of why Norway hasn't necessarily integrated Indigenous knowledge about burning into their wildfire response and into their prescribed burning, is simply because at this point it's not thought about as a priority in terms of land management. But I suspect that will change, as I said. So, yeah, thanks. Hard question to start me off, Emma.
Sorry.
And I wanted to say too that because you mentioned where you're located in Australia, and I know a little bit about Australian fire, but I don't know a lot about it. And I'm very, very curious about how what I've said today resonates with what people know about what's happening in Australia or not. Like, what are some of the differences between what happens in British Columbia or Norway in this Northern Hemisphere versus Australia? How has smoke been experienced in Australia differently than Norway? I think those are like really interesting questions that I haven't got a chance to ask, but hopefully we can talk a little bit about them.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. I'm not the person. I actually spent our last bushfire season in the outback, so a long way away from any combustible anythings. But I'm sure other people will have a very immediate experience of that. In the meantime, we've got a question from Nancy.
Thanks very much for a great paper. Really enjoyed it. I'm from the University of Newcastle, and I've done a little bit of work on bushfire smoke here in Australia, responding to the unprecedented smoke of the Black Summer fires. And I think you asked for, how are people hearing what you've been talking about? I guess my surprise is that the prescribed burning, that Australia is seen as a world leader in that, because it is so established as a practice here in its various forms. It's still controversial. It's still, people think it could be done better. People think that wasn't a good day to do a prescribed burn.
Of course, yeah.
They get away. They cause uncontrolled fires sometimes, and so on. But yeah, that was my big surprise. But my question, sort of, I have two areas I'd like to go into, so I'll just ask one now and I'll come back to another one if there's time. And you mentioned that fire, especially sort of low-level prescribed burning, can be good in terms of managing invasive species. And you were thinking and mentioned flora species. I wondered if you have looked at all at fauna and the relationship between the animals that live in the forests and smoke. When I was doing that research on the smoke here, there was some evidence that mice, in particular, a particular study group of mice that were being used in the Canberra area, had a very high mortality rate during the high smoke days. And I just wondered if you've looked at all at the sort of the more than human implications of both the uncontrolled smoke and smoke from prescribed burning?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is sort of disappointing. I haven't looked, I'm not an ecologist. And so I don't really know a lot about, I have to depend on the work of ecologists to understand the impacts of smoke and fire on the landscape and on animals. But I think that's a really interesting question. And I have seen similar studies to the one that you're referring to. In Australia. I think that the paper that I saw was also based in Australia, which is sort of one of the reasons why we think about Australia as being a leader in some of these fields, is because you folks have done quite a bit of very good research. I haven't seen anything about the impacts of smoke either from prescribed burning or from wildfire on animals in Canada or in Norway. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I haven't seen it. But I think it's a really interesting question. And we do know of, like, there's lots of studies, of course, that talk about the benefits of both prescribed burning and wildfire or low intensity wildfire generally on animals, of course, because it creates, it frees up nutrients, which creates good conditions for browse, for moose, for example. So we know that Indigenous people were burning intentionally to attract ungulates for hunting. But I haven't seen similar research on the impacts of smoke. So that's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, muted. We've got a question from Philippa Baum. Please jump in.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to, I've got one question I wanted to draw your attention to. I don't know if you know about the Fire Centre Research Hub at the University of Tasmania, but they have, you know, a selection of both researchers and practitioners, pyrogeographers, Indigenous practitioners, and also people working in public health. So they're quite an interesting group. You might find some of their work interesting. It's at the University of Tasmania, called Fire Centre. So yeah. And the other one, I was kind of really interested in your point about how we need to kind of reconsider ideas about smoke in a more relational sense. I have read some work by, there was an anthropologist called, I think it's Simone Dennis, who wrote a book called, Simone Dennis, she wrote a book called Smoke Free, which was kind of looking at the sort of sensory aspects of smoke and how we can think about, you know, the construction of a sort of the public sphere and the role of smoke in the public sphere. And I was just wondering if you've engaged with that work at all, and whether or not you've kind of, you know, where you're thinking around the relational aspects and our new ways to kind of engage with smoke, where that is sort of going, because that seemed very interesting to me.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And I was not aware of this fire center at the University of Tasmania, but I'll look them up. There is a similar research group here funded by the EU, which I've been taking part in, which has been really great. And then I also have some contacts at the University of Northern British Columbia back home who are doing some sort of contemporary smoke research. And it's very helpful for the work that I do and sort of to kind of tie the historical piece to the present. So thank you for that recommendation. I will look them up. And then in terms of your question about relationality, this is something that I've been thinking a lot about, kind of on a personal level as well as on an academic level. And I have thought a lot about the sensory experience of smoke, because of course, I mean, as all of you know, on a bad smoke day, your senses are overwhelmed, right? Like even in your house, you can't escape the feeling of the smoke, the heaviness in your lungs, the scratchiness. It pervades all your senses, and it's not very nice most of the time. And so yeah, so I've thought about it a lot, because you know I live in this community, which is right on the edge of the Boreal Forest, where you know if I continue to live there for the rest of my life, I'm going to be breathing smoke for the rest of my life. So how am I going to come to terms? This is the question, right? How am I going to come to terms with breathing smoke in a way that's sort of healthy for, or, you know, not physically healthy, because obviously smoke is harmful, but sort of mentally healthy, because we will have smoke in the future on our environments. And as I said, sort of hopefully we can control the amount of that, but it will be there. It will always be there. And so, yeah, I don't have a good answer for this, because I think this is kind of this is the question, right? How are we going to incorporate smoke into our lives? You know, given that it's harmful, given that nobody likes breathing smoke, how can we come to terms with it? And I think for me, the place where I have arrived at is thinking about sort of doing the cultural thing that we've been doing for 1,000 or more years, since time immemorial. We've been doing this, right? Differentiating between what is smoke that's a sign of something good happening on the land. So, for example, when I'm breathing in smoke when I'm outside, and I know that it's because there's a prescribed burn going on, I can say, yes, this is smoke and it's kind of unpleasant to bring in, but this is a sign that something healthy is going on, that there's a cleansing happening, that nearby the ecology is happy because people are burning away all the invasive Himalayan blackberry. And in the spring, there's going to be awesome blueberries there, and there's going to be beautiful fireweed that grows there. So I can kind of accept that breathing the smoke in that moment is sort of a sacrifice that I'm making for a healthier ecologic future. But of course, you know, I can't comfort myself in the same way on a day when I know that there's a catastrophic wildfire ripping through a neighboring community, and the smoke that I'm breathing is the result of people's homes and livelihoods being destroyed. So yeah, I don't have a good answer. I think this is something that, as citizens of a world that are going to be breathing in smoke, that we all kind of have to think about on an individual level.
Okay.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm back. Sorry. That was a drama.
Sorry.
My phone, my computer crashed, so I'm on my mobile now. I might
Classic.
jump in with, yeah, a bit of drama. Anyway, I might jump in with a question, and apologies if somebody else answered something along these lines while I was gone. But I was really curious to note what seemed to me to be some of the overlaps between the kind of the smoke phobia that you were describing from the 1960s onwards, and perhaps the emergence of an anti-smoking movement, particularly in places like Australia and North America and so on.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if those two phenomena were connected. Like, do you see any kind of discursive slippage between public health messaging around anti-tobacco campaigning and the sort of language that starts to inflect the smoke phobia from wildfires?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. I'm so glad you asked that question. And I wish that I had had the foresight to pull up an article that I found from, I think it was like 1973 or 1976, where this exact thing happened. So in fact, somebody wrote this angry editorial to one of the major newspapers in British Columbia, where they said essentially the Forest Service has a double standard because, or not the Forest Service, the government, the British Columbian government, because the Forest Service doesn't regulate smoking, of course, but the British Columbian government is setting a double standard, because while on the one hand, they are banning smoking, so the simple pleasure that we have, that people have to smoke in public spaces, they're banning it. They're saying it's a bad thing, that it's terrible for our health. And at the same time as they're doing that, they are, first of all, allowing the continuation of wildfire, which includes smoke pollution in these same urban spaces. And they're not only that, but they are burning a bunch of logging waste on the hillsides around Vancouver and contributing directly to smoke pollution. So why aren't we as individual citizens in British Columbia allowed to smoke and produce this pollution, and yet the government is? So
Right.
It's kind of like an exact manifestation of what you're talking about. There is sort of, people are pointing out that there's a little bit of hypocrisy going on in some sense.
Interesting.
And that was, yeah, super interesting. And one of the things that I did as part of the early stages of this research was I looked at some of the history of anti-smoking and anti-smoking campaigns that were conducted both from cigarette smoke and from marijuana smoke. Interestingly, there was some research that was done on that. And I couldn't find, aside from some of these like primary sources that I've just described, I couldn't find any places where, like in the secondary literature, where people were sort of drawing the connection between the pollution created by smoking a cigarette versus, you know, the pollution that you might get from wildfire smoke. But I think you're right. Like there is, it's part of the same general sense that smoke is unhealthy, that smoke is bad for you, that smoke is sort of a sign of uncleanliness and wrongness in the environment. These are things that are being recruited by anti-smoking campaigns, as well as urban air pollution campaigns or anti-urban air pollution campaigns, as well as the Forest Service when it talks about wildfire smoke or its intentional prescribed burning. So yes, super interesting. And I would love to see more crossover in terms of, especially like in the sensory history realm. I think there's like a lot more room for understanding some of those crossovers.
Yeah, fascinating. I can't see if anyone else has their hand up, but maybe I had one other, if I can ask a secondary question.
Go for it.
I was curious to know, like here in Australia, I think roughly around the same time, probably middle of the 20th century, in urban areas, there's a lot of a clampdown against domestic fires. So people who had fireplaces at home were frowned upon if they were using wood fires for domestic heating. And yet, if people went to the bush, to the countryside, there was still a certain romance around the idea of a wood fire in a country house or around a campfire or something. I wonder if you've seen similar things in other places too, this idea that in densely populated areas, domestic fire or open fires in general are very hazardous to human health, but that perhaps in certain controlled ways in the outdoors, there's more of a romance or more of an acceptance of those kinds of small fires.
Yeah, interesting. I haven't seen that kind of binary that you're talking about. I think it's a lot more complicated, perhaps for cultural reasons. Of course, domestic burning of wood was a big part of urban air regulation. So when we're talking about smoke abatement movements in the UK and in Canada and in the United States, often part of the conversation is around the fact that people are still using wood to heat their homes, and that there are potentially cleaner fuels that could be used in those spaces to reduce pollution. And this is part of kind of what urban air pollution historians have talked about, is sort of deflecting responsibility away from industrial polluters and putting the onus for pollution on individuals. This is sort of something that historians have understood as part of that smoke abatement movement. But at the same time, there is, I think, in both British Columbia and Norway, and I'm curious if this is a cultural difference with Australia, there's a real glorification of wood heat in general. It is kind of, especially in the late 20th century, it's idealized in a really interesting way. So, I mean, one of my favorite facts about Norway is our all-time best-selling book in Norway is about cutting firewood, which I think says something to you about Norwegians' attachment to the wood fireplace as a sort of a function of life, and especially a comfortable, cozy life. And in British Columbia, you see actually you see the use of wood heat as a potential way of reducing wildfire smoke pollution. So one of the potential solutions to the problem of slash smoke and wildfire smoke that's proposed by people is, instead of burning all this fuel that we have on the land or letting wildfires rip through it, why don't we cut it up and let people use it to heat their homes? And the argument goes like, you know, what's less enjoyable than not only the heat from somebody's home fireplace, but also the smoke. The smoke is sweet. It's nice, you know, it's cozy. It has all these positive qualities that people talk about, which is hilarious because of course wood smoke from your fireplace is no different than the smoke that would have come out of a slash pile if you'd burned that same wood en masse on the land. But there's this real cultural differentiation between those two kinds of smoke. And then on top of that, we see that, in fact, although the Forest Service in British Columbia sort of laughed at this as a potential solution for their fuel problem on the land, in Norway, we do that quite effectively. And I mean, that has to do, of course, with land mass. In Norway, the amount of logging waste that we have to deal with is infinitesimal compared to the amount of logging waste that we have to deal with in British Columbia. There's simply not enough wood stoves in the province of British Columbia to burn all that wood, even if it's burned year round. But in Norway, this is what people have done for hundreds of years. And so you can actually see in the newspapers advertisements where a logging company says, hey, we have a bunch of logging waste that's sitting out here. If anybody would like to come pick it up to burn it, you can just come get it. And people would like go out into the woods and collect this logging waste and bring it home to burn in their stoves. And so what this does is, although, you know, we're still creating smoke on the land, it divides that smoke up. So rather than having like one big burn like we do in British Columbia when we set everything on fire in a huge pile, those pieces of wood and their combustion are being sort of distributed a little bit more evenly across the landscape. And so it actually does, in the end, to some extent, reduce the amount of smoke pollution. So yeah, so I don't think we see the same kind of binary, but we see like some really interesting and complex rhetoric around the potential differences between the domestic smoke that you have coming out of your fireplace versus the smoke that you might have out in the woods. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks, Steve.
That Steve's question and your response made me think about the really interesting point you made about what the relationship is between kind of large scale governmental policies and individual action. Like you said, you know, basically agencies aren't keen on outsourcing prescribed burns to the civilian, you know. There's a need to keep that under control. And it just, I mean, the first thing that came into my mind when you said this, which is maybe a very Australian story, maybe it isn't, is it seems to me whenever there is a forest fire, bushfire here, the first question is arson. So, you know, I'm not sure if that's the case in BC or in the States or in Norway. But I mean, you also made the comment that we all like to light fires, which
that might have been an overgeneralization.
Look, I find relatable. But as like you know, small scale. So yeah, I mean, I kind of think the way that like there's something really interesting in this about the ways in which we as individual actors interact with larger bodies, governmental agencies, the Forest Service, whatever, in terms of what we can and can't do regarding fire management. It's not a question. It's a very, very open comment. If you've got a response.
Yeah, I think that this is a huge tension that exists, and yeah, I'm not really sure how it'll play out. So I've done my little bit of future gazing, but in that regard, I'm not really sure where we're going to end up on this. I think, like, from my perspective, putting fire and putting land management back into the hands of the people who live on the land and know that land really well is the way forward, right? Because I think they can make the best decisions about when to burn and how much to burn, because they know. But I also worked for the government for part of my life before I came back to academia. And so I can also sort of understand and sympathize with the hesitancy of sort of decentralizing some of this work, because it opens up fire and land management in a way that is going to be very difficult to manage and impossible to standardize, right? Land management is going to look a lot different in the hands of individual citizens than it has under sort of this ubiquitous agency control for the last 100 years. So I don't know, I'm not sure how that's going to end up, but I'm curious to see how the province and how the Ministry of Forests in British Columbia manages that, because they are now sort of mandated to do it. So we'll see what they end up doing. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Nancy, I saw your hand up earlier. Do you have another question that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, or a comment at least. Yeah, I'm just really enjoying this conversation and wishing we were all in a room and could just sort of batter things back and forth. But we're fortunate to have you zooming into Australia, Mika. So that's great. In the piece that I wrote, my background is more looking at urban air pollution and the way that it was relatively successfully controlled here in Australia. So I'm based at the University of Newcastle, as I said, and so Newcastle, Australia had a steelworks and had a very serious coal smoke problem in the 1950s, and started taking measures here with Ringelmann charts and so on. And then the state government came in with some clean air legislation in the 60s. So that all worked quite well. And I was wondering how that model could be extended to control bushfire smoke, because I think now it is, as you suggested, it's just in the too hard basket, it's too diffused, you can't point at someone as being the entity that created that smoke. But I wonder if you've thought about this at all. And I guess I was wondering whether when development applications and environmental impact statements and so on are being developed, whether the likelihood that the enterprise is going to create more pyrophilic conditions that will lead to smoke, that will lead to air pollution, whether that could be a route to trying to control this. So again, I guess I wondered if you'd gone down that track at all, to thinking about how the buck could be made to stop somewhere.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm also not sure that it's necessarily desirable that I don't know how productive it is to start fining the Forest Service for the smoke that it creates, for example, which is something that we can do to industrial polluters. It's really complicated. This is the reason why we haven't addressed, well, it's one of the reasons that we haven't addressed wildfire smoke pollution, is because it's really complicated to get at why it exists and who is responsible, because the actors in creating those plumes are so diverse and so spread out across time and space, and the functions of the ecology have impacted the actions that people have taken in ways that we can't possibly predict. So these forests, more than they are sort of purely the responsibility of they're not the product of a Forest Service that has sort of top-down managed them in every way. They're a hybrid entity, right? Like everything in our world is sort of a hybrid entity. It's the culmination of the work of nature, the work of ecology, the work of trees and plants and animals on the land, as well as the work of the Forest Service and the work of Indigenous people and the work of farmers and agricultural initiatives and that kind of thing. So it's extremely complex. I'm not sure that pointing the finger at any one person is necessarily the answer in the same way that it potentially was for, you know, pointing a finger at a coal plant and saying, you need to stop putting pollution into the air. I do think, so again, this is me stepping uncomfortably out of my role as a historian, but I do think that perhaps the solution is to be a little bit more interventionist into these processes that are causing wildfire smoke pollution. So while at the moment when we have wildfire smoke pollution, we throw up our hands and we say, we have no control over this. We have no idea how or why it got here. It's an act of God, it's an act of nature. We wash our hands of it. There's, you know, rather than sort of that attitude, can we start to think about, okay, what are the actions that we can take to mitigate this? Is there ways that we can potentially move pieces like communities that are going to be impacted by wildfire smoke to places where they will be less impacted? Are there ways that we can sort of make people less vulnerable to its impacts? And are there ways that we can go into these spaces and make them less susceptible to creating these kinds of pollution in the future? So prescribed burning, for example. And I think that what that requires is sort of a fundamental shift in the way that we think about land management in British Columbia, but I think probably in all of our fire ecologies. We need to stop, I think, thinking of ourselves, and particularly in the Forest Service needs to stop thinking of itself as being a land manager, right? It's not just a land manager, it's also an air manager. So if we can kind of like change the way we think about our impact on the land and how those impacts manifest in different ways, then, you know, potentially we can start thinking of ourselves as, managing the air that comes out of these forests, in addition to sort of managing the trees that grow there and their timber products. So.
Sorry, can I have a very quick question? I put up the wrong hand.
Of course.
Really fascinating discussion, thank you. And I feel like a bit of a tourist in this area, so I'm sorry this is a stupid question, but as you were speaking about that and thinking about like the responsibility for smoke, I wonder as well as, I guess, natural smoke, I think tends to be like, it's not the product that's created or the thing that starts it, it's the fire. And then it just made me think about how in Australia we evacuate for fire. And I don't know, do we ever evacuate people and communities because of smoke?
Yeah, we do in BC. I'm not sure in Australia, but there are incidences, especially in First Nations communities, where like elders have been evacuated for smoke inhalation.
Okay. And just like as a response as well to you know, talking about a personal reaction to smoke, I quite like the smell of backburn. It's I remember growing up, it was always, you know, being based in Sydney, enjoying backburning season because it smelled so lovely and warm and inviting. But, you know, with the knowledge that it could get out of control, or, you know, it could turn so quickly, it does put another dimension on that experience. But I haven't lived in Australia for a while as well, but I do remember just as a kid just really enjoying that. So
yeah, no, that's a really common and interesting response. And in some ways, like the ability to kind of smell wood smoke and say, oh, it smells good, is a little bit of a privilege of living in an urban space, right? Because people that are like living closer to the fires are going to smell that and have a much different response. But I also have seen, and I agree with you, I fully agree with you. I also have these, and I think it's potentially part of growing up and living in a community that was close to a lot of kind of prescribed burning in the past. And like, again, like you say, back burning, this is like intentional burning, I assume that's happening. And I remember enjoying that as well. And there's places in the documentary record, especially in some of the oral histories that I've looked at, where people talk about how the smell of smoke for them is associated with the changing of the leaves in the fall and eating sweet, crisp apples and getting like the first frost on the ground and all these sort of pleasant sensory memories that they sort of associate with the smell of burning from prescribed fire. So your response is, I think, quite common. And I think it's really interesting to see how, in the present context of catastrophic wildfire and some of these smoke seasons that have been coming through, how I'm not sure about this, but I think we've lost some of that positive association in some ways and perhaps in some communities. So, rather than having faith that the smell of smoke on the air is like a part of sort of the natural turning of the seasons, the work of people on the land, caring for the land, we no longer sort of have that secure knowledge. Now we have associated wildfire smoke with some of these catastrophic and horrible events. So yeah, I think that is a really interesting observation and a common one, and one that is potentially changing under climate change, but we'll see what happens. So thank you. Yeah.
Can I also just add something very small?
Yeah.
Because you kind of mentioned, and talking about health with Steve's questions as well. I think recently I saw in Australia that there are a few firefighters who are demanding that the state provide greater health insurance because of the health effects. And I know that's not the Indigenous communities that you're talking about, but the comment about those that are more, that are closer to the fires and the smoke and the disproportionate health costs there. So I thought that was a really interesting space potentially. I don't know, where your research is going in the future.
Yeah.
And whether that has like a history of responsibility from the state to those that are fighting the fires or dealing with the smoke on a closer proximity than those that aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that my colleagues at the University of Northern British Columbia are looking at as part of their health sciences work, and it's super, super important. And what I've learned from them is that actually we don't really know how forest fire fighters' health is impacted by smoke. A lot of these people are seasonal workers. They're like students or young people who are sort of only in the Forest Service for a couple of years, and then they go on to other work. And of course, they only work during the summer. So they're pretty hard to keep track of from a research standpoint to kind of look at the long-term effect of smoke. But of course, now that smoke seasons are year-round and many of these people are working full-time and there's more of them, right? We have a lot more people in our wildfire fighting services and they're working year-round. Now we can sort of start to get a better sense of what some of these health impacts are. But yeah, I was very surprised to learn how little we actually know about how smoke impacts forest firefighters. And you said that that this is not the Indigenous communities that necessarily that we're talking about, but it actually is, because many of these crews are Indigenous crews. Like this is something that works quite well for Indigenous people, especially in the north, where there's a lot of communities and it's a great source of seasonal work. So there are actually a lot of Indigenous people working for these fire services, often for longer and more prolonged periods of time than settler forest firefighters. So this is also an equity issue from that angle as well. So yeah, it's a good point.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to jump back in. We are just a little bit over time. So I'm going to once again thank you so much for a wonderful talk and a really, really great discussion, I think. Everyone who is still with us, please join me in giving Micah a hand of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun to talk about some of this stuff.
Great. It was wonderful to hear from you. Thanks so much.